Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Future Build session on how we can mandate change to tackle the climate crisis. This session was put together by Future Build in collaboration with UK Green Building Council and The Edge. And I'm Julie Hiragoyen, I'm the Chief Exec of the UKGBC. And for those of you who don't know who we are, we're a charity and an industry network with a mission to radically improve the sustainability of the built environment. So I'm delighted to be chairing this particular session. We have something like 430 or so members that span the whole of the built environment value chain, all striving towards that same mission. I'm pleased to say all of the private sector representatives on the panel are members of UKGBC, and we work very closely with BEIS and CBC as well. So that's who we are. We're here to talk about how to mandate change. And before I introduce our panelists, I thought I'd take a couple of minutes just to set the scene very briefly, because we're 8 weeks into 2020 and we've had constant reminders of the scale and urgency of the climate emergency already this year. We started the year sort of scarred from many of the images and not sure that the clicker's working, that's right. Scarred from the trauma of witnessing months of these horrendous bushfires in Australia, millions of animals destroyed, acres of land, many people dying. Then we went straight into Davos in January, where the World Economic Forum launched its latest global annual risks report. For the first time ever, it found that the top 5 global risks by both likelihood and severity were all environmental. So I think that tells us something. And then, of course, closer to home, we have had, what we just saw last weekend, our third major storm in less than 2 months, sharing its name actually with one of our panelists today. So far this year, we've hardly had a day where we haven't had amber and red warnings all across the UK in terms of flood risk. And of course, as we sit here today, many hundreds of homes still underwater. The reason why everyone is talking about climate change now, including politicians, including the media, including probably all of you, is I think because we're all just waking up to the enormity, the importance and the urgency of the challenge and the scale of that challenge. We know from the science that a lot of this is going to get worse before it gets better. And if we want to, even if we manage to reduce our emissions to net zero, we've still got a heck of a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere to draw back down if we want to stay within 2 degrees of warming. At present, we're on course for 4 or 5 degrees, so we've got a huge amount to do. And if we don't make significant progress within this next 10 years, we won't stand a chance of achieving that. So there are tipping points that we don't understand. There are feedback loops that we're not sure about, pointers we don't really know. We're in an uncharted territory. What we do know is that climate change is getting worse faster, and that it's not going to wait for us to have all the answers. So it's immensely important that we take action now. That explains why people are taking to the streets. This is a demand that can't not be met. It's no longer about imaginary future generations. This is actually about people, young people alive today whose future lives and livelihoods are at risk. And in case you're wondering, this photograph is not taken at an Extinction Rebellion protest or anything like that. It was actually taken on the global climate strike last September, where hundreds of built environment professionals gathered outside our offices at the UK Green Building Council, calling for more change, calling for their voices to be heard by Whitehall for more change for this sector. So this isn't, these are professional architects, engineers, investors, developers, and we'll see much more of that, no doubt. Now, you know the stats, no doubt. The built environment is hugely important because it's a huge part of the problem. Some of the stats on the slide are well rehearsed. Up to 40% of our carbon footprint can somehow be attributed to the built environment. And it's also been consistently identified as one of our most cost-effective levers to pull to decarbonize our economy. Albeit a very complex one and a very fragmented industry, it is one of our more cost-effective industries to decarbonise. It's also an industry that typically has very long asset life cycles and is made up of infrastructure as much as it is of buildings. I put this image up because last week's news from the Court of Appeal around Heathrow's third runway was potentially fairly momentous and groundbreaking in terms of how development decisions may be overturned in future if they don't comply with our climate ambitions. So how that decision squares up with some of the planning approvals that are being provided across the country for thousands of homes to be built to poor quality standards and in floodplains, time will tell, but whether some of that spills over into other asset types. We're clearly on a trajectory, a very aggressive trajectory to achieve net zero by 2050. That leaves nowhere to hide and no sector will be left behind on that. No sector will be unaffected. For buildings, what that means globally and universally, the consensus is that we need all new buildings to be net zero carbon in operation by 2030, with significantly reduced embodied emissions by that point, and that we need all buildings, both new and existing, to be net zero carbon whole life by 2050. So that's the context of what we're talking about today. And just to provide the last piece of context, from a policy perspective, many different inquiries have found over the past few years that the government is off track in meeting our carbon targets. Major policy gaps still exist, as you can see from the red and red-hatched segments of that graph there. We have virtually no policies in place at the moment to tackle existing buildings. Retrofit activity is at an all-time low, and even the building regs are not yet on track to be net zero carbon, or on a net zero carbon trajectory, I should say. So there is quite a long way to go, but the good news is that we have a fantastic panel of experts to kick this around today, and we'll shortly be hearing from them as to how both regulations and market forces will mandate some of that change. So without further ado, I want to introduce them to you. First up will be Ben Golding, who's the Director of Energy Efficiency and Local at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. He's responsible for leading government's work on energy efficiency across the residential, business, industry and public sectors in support of the ambition to achieve that net zero target by 2050, as well as the government's approach to tackling fuel poverty. Next to Ben is Bill Hughes, Head of Real Assets at Legal and General Investment Management. He, with responsibility for the company's direct investment capabilities in property and infrastructure. Bill is also Chair of the Property Industry Alliance, past President of the British Property Federation, and also a much loved trustee of the UKGBC. And then George Mendonca from Grosvenor, Executive Board Director at Grosvenor, Britain and Ireland, next to Bill, appointed to lead Grosvenor development in June 2018. He's responsible for Grosvenor's activity outside central London, particularly expanding the strategic land business and the creation of new business. Next to George, we have Andrew Day, Director of Sustainability at Telford Homes, with over 30 years' experience delivering residential and mixed-use schemes. With colleagues, he's driving commercially sound sustainability innovation through the firm's Building a Living Legacy strategy to 2024, which we'll hear more about. And last but by no means least, Julie Godfroy, a sustainability consultant and CIBC's technical manager. She's a chartered engineer who's worked in most sectors with a particular interest in housing and heritage buildings, and her work focuses on low and zero carbon strategies, as well as health and well-being. So, speakers, you have 8 to 10 minutes. I will be giving you some time checks, and then we'll go straight into Q&A. I'm going to suggest you hand straight over to one another, and that will avoid me popping up like a yo-yo. So, Ben, straight over to you. You need to click it quite hard.
I can do the clicker. Thanks, Julie. So, the first thing to say is, Julie set out the policy gap, the challenge we've got to face. I'm not going to dispute that we need to do more. I'm not going to dispute that we need to actually accelerate things. So I think the message is, there's a big call out to Whitehall to hear this. It has been heard. We haven't fixed the problem yet. And I'm not going to tell you exactly how we're going to do that because I can't pre-announce policy. What I do want to do is talk about some of what we're doing, some of the context, some of the scale of the challenge, and a bit of what's on our mind in Whitehall. And in the spirit of the message having been heard, the picture in front of you is the Prime Minister and David Attenborough together announcing a year of climate action in the run-up to the COP26 conference at the end of the year. So message heard at the highest levels, but we really, really do need to get on with it. Starting from the top level context, so we are way off track globally. The grey bar at the top of this chart is business as usual. That's the projected warming. That's a 4.1 to 4.8 degree world. We're living pretty much in a 1 degree world now, and the impacts, as you've seen from Julie's opening, are devastating. So this is something we cannot avoid doing, and you can see the sense of what we need to do. So get to that ambition of 1.5 degrees. That's the little green bar right down at the bottom of this chart, way below the pledges and targets stuff in the middle, which is that sense of what would happen if every country in the world fulfilled the upper end of the ambition that we've set out. So we need to do more. We need increased ambition globally, and we also need increased ambition from us in the UK. So that's the dark cloud. The silver lining, there is a massive opportunity to doing this. So this is just a bit of a sense from one sector. This is Bloomberg's estimate of the investment opportunities globally just in the power sector between now and 2050. Their view is 80% of that is expected to be low carbon technologies. That is just one sector. So if you look across the board, including in buildings, there will be absolutely colossal investment opportunities. In the UK, our best estimate is staying on track for net zero over the next decade is a £100 billion investment opportunity. Zooming in a bit further to the UK, they're already getting on for 500,000 jobs in the low carbon businesses and supply chain. And the low carbon economy's turnover grew by 5% in 2018, faster than the rest of GDP. So we're a relatively small part of the economy still, but we're growing very rapidly and faster than other things. There's one estimate that I've seen that shows that if you assume a decent level of innovation, that low carbon sector could be worth £27 billion GVA by 2050 and another £26 billion from exports. There's a huge, huge opportunity here, and that is good news for governments. So how are we doing? We're doing well, but, and the but will be coming. So I looked across the board. Actually, the UK's doing relatively well from a global perspective. Since 1990, our economy's grown faster than the G7 average, while we've cut emissions by 43%, also significantly faster than other G7 economies. But I think we do need to recognise that in some ways that's because we've done the easy bit, and that keeping that track record, keeping that momentum up, is going to need effort in some of the harder sectors. I'll come back to that in a moment. We're helped in this by the Climate Change Act, which was set in 2008. So that's our legal framework, which set the original 2050 target of 80% and which now enshrines the net zero target. The way that works is it gives us something called carbon budgets, which is a total emissions cap on UK emissions in every 5-year period. They're set 15 years ahead. To date, we've set them out to 2032, which is the 5th carbon budget, and that requires us to cut emissions by 57% relative to 1990. 1 and 2, we've met, fantastic. 3, we're on track. 4 and 5, we have a policy gap. We will need to accelerate ambition, and we will need to do more. A bit of what that means in practice. And, one of my slides has mysteriously disappeared. Oh, no, they've just changed order. Let's start here. So a bit of what that means in practice for different sectors. If you look down from the top, so we know what we're doing on transport. Most of the emissions come from cars and vans, and we know that tackling those is about ultra-low emission vehicles on the road, and to some extent HGVs, aviation, shipping, but we kind of know what the technology solution is there. Similarly, for the power sector, that is renewables, it's nuclear, it's low carbon generation across the piece. We have a good sense of what we're going to do, and the momentum's strong. For natural resources, and a lot of the remaining challenge is about afforestation and decarbonising agriculture. That's harder, and it's less well understood, but there is definitely an effort there. The other bits of it are an awful lot about buildings. So Julie gave that sense of it's 40% one way or another, and this backs that up. So that's the hard part. We have some unarguable things, like we need more energy efficiency across the board, but actually things like the heat pathway, like the technology mix for industrial process decarbonisation, are much more difficult, and that's where we need to accelerate. So backing that up a bit, I just wanted to break down the economy. So I talked about the good progress we've made across the board. This chart gives that sense of but it's far from universal. So we are, to some extent, riding a wave of success in the power sector. So that's the green bar second down. You can see in the last few years, emissions from power have dropped sharply. Now, over time, that's been a mix of the growth of renewables, it's been the move away from coal, and it's been, frankly, renewables getting an awful lot cheaper as time's gone by. And that's carrying a certain amount of the economy. We've also seen really good progress in industrial decarbonisation, which is a mix of energy efficiency, but it's also just structural change in the economy, that move towards the service sector growing. So we're not there yet. Natural resources, the other one that's fallen, and that's mostly about the impact of the landfill tax, and it's just resources being diverted away. Buildings, meanwhile, stay pretty flat, as does transport. Now, to give them their due, that is in the face of growth in the number of buildings and the number of cars on the road. So energy efficiency is a big offset. But what's very clear is if we're looking at net zero, that kind of just holding things flat cannot possibly continue. And we will need buildings to be virtually zero carbon by 2050 to have any chance of meeting that long-term target. A little plug for COP26. So Julie introduced this by talking about the opportunity now, this decade, this year. I would say both are absolutely pivotal. So if you think about the pathway to 2050, we've got 30 years now, and 30 years is about the length of time it's taken historically to do any major change of technology. So to get anything from kind of early days to market scale takes 30 years. That's exactly what we've got, so we have to have a foot firmly on the pedal. COP26 is a great moment to galvanise support around that. It is going to be the largest event of its kind the UK has ever hosted. We're expecting over 30,000 delegates and world leaders representing 196 countries. It'll be a showcase for what we're doing and a chance to push for increased ambition internationally. But it's also a bit of a rallying cry to the UK, because there's one thing you learn from international diplomacy on climate change, it's that walking the walk is the thing that persuades others. So it's a good opportunity for us to really push the envelope on what we're doing. It is future build, so I couldn't finish without a couple of slides on buildings. The 2020s, let's start there. So it's going to be an absolutely pivotal decade. First, because we've got some huge strategic choices, particularly on questions around where we go on heat. So with 30 years to go, we are going to need to really accelerate work on this. We've got some important choices like understanding the safety, the viability of hydrogen as a large-scale heat decarbonisation option alongside other technologies, heat pumps, district heating. What's the mix? We will need to make some choices in the 2020s, otherwise we will time out. We need to accelerate low regrets deployment in the meantime, so there's stuff we can do to scale up the supply chain for low-carbon heat, ready to move in whichever direction we need to go. That's particularly, but not exclusively, off the gas grid, where the technology choices are more limited. And we also just need to push on energy efficiency right across the board. There are also some big policy milestones this decade. So the fuel poverty target, that's a legally binding target to get all fuel-poor homes, as far as reasonably practicable, to energy efficiency band C by 2030. That hits at the end of the decade, and we've got legally binding milestones this year and in 2025 along the way. The fifth carbon budget I've mentioned already, that's work by 2030, we're firmly into that, and that's close to a 60% reduction on 1990 at national scale. ECO, the current phase, comes to an end in 2022. We've committed to maintaining at least that current level of funding, £640 million a year through to at least 2028, so we need to set out where that's going. The future home standard will come in by 2025, so that's a commitment to have new homes with high levels of energy efficiency and low carbon heat. We've got to get the detail of that firmly sorted out. And we've also committed to setting out trajectories for ambition on rented sector buildings. So we've already consulted on APC-B as a minimum standard for business buildings by 2028. We'll look at doing the same, setting out of ambition for the domestic sector, and we'll go firm on those. Last slide. This year, so I said at the start, I won't lay out the whole solution. I won't lay out everything we might do this year because I can't pre-announce things, but just a sense of some of what's on our mind. So for businesses, we'll be publishing our response to that consultation on rental sector minimum standards. This year, under streamlined energy and carbon reporting, it's the first year that 12,000 large and listed UK businesses will have to start submitting new data on their energy use alongside annual reports. We've now issued over £5 million to support innovative solutions for SMEs to try and break down some of those barriers to energy efficiencies in those businesses, which are the majority of UK business. For homes, we are committed to publish a revised fuel poverty strategy this year, updating exactly how we're going to meet that 2030 target. and also setting out that trajectory for rented sector homes. And finally, we're working with MHLG on the Future Home Standard, where the detail is critical. And in the public sector, only 2% of emissions, but a vital enabler and a catalyst for change. We'll be setting out a roadmap to 2050, saying how we're going to do the funding, capacity, capability building in that sector. So I think that's probably it from me, just to end with a bit of a call to action from us. So I suppose that government's got a serious role in this. We need to up our game in terms of the policy, in terms of driving progress and change. But we can't do that without the pull from the other end. So the call is to our industry colleagues to come alongside us and make this a year of climate action. Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Ben. I'm going to say a few things that I think coincide with what Ben's going to say, but I haven't got slides. I just wanted to get across a few key issues from my perspective at L&G. First of all, it's worth thinking about the role that I play here and what L&G is about. So the business I work for is Legal and General Investment Management, which, rough numbers, is responsible for investing around about 1.2 trillion sterling around the world. And of that, around about 35 billion is in what I call real assets, so relevant to the responsibility I have. And I'll start out by saying I totally agree that the government can't do this on its own, and that the private sector needs to participate and work with government to get stuff done. And I'll hopefully elucidate a little how we think about that. So my words really fall into three main areas. I want to talk about we're being purposeful. I want to talk about the ambition we have. And I also want to talk about the complexity of what we're facing. So let me start with purposefulness and what our intent is. It's worth starting with the thought that the responsibility I have above all else is to do what's right for the investment capital I represent, because it's not my capital. We are simply the guardians of the capital for long-term pensioners and savers in the UK. So we are just an aggregator. And in that context, we have a duty to protect the value of the investments we make, including protecting them against environmental change and climate change. But think of us as being the guardian of capital. So we have to think about how would we make a positive difference. That's really what we must remind ourselves that we're about. As it happens, I run a business that is also thinking about its investment universe. And for me, that is the totality of the built environment. I don't think about residential or commercial real estate in isolation. I also think about social and economic infrastructure. And the reason that's relevant is that the connections between the totality of the built environment are relevant to everybody who lives within the planet. The connections are as important as the individual components themselves. And finally, in terms of my view of intent, we have to think about the long term. You've seen some charts there and some comments about timeframes. The investments we're making have to be making sense, have enduring sense, having relevance over the long term. We're not here to invest in and out and make money in the short term. We're here to create a positive influence over long time frames. And the L&G approach, therefore, sits very well with what government would want to have happen and with what UKGBC would be thinking about and what we should all be worried about, which is the climate crisis in front of us. The other thing I'll say alongside that is, wearing my other hat for a second, as Julie said, I'm the chair of something called the Property Industry Alliance. And as it so happens, last week, the PIA, as we call it, launched a document called Best Practice Framework for Responsible Real Estate Industry. And the point of that document was to remind government and for the industry itself to speak with one voice about what we must prioritise. And in that document, which we can send around by email, in that document, it emphasises climate change, environment, social impact, balancing profits against the wider impacts we're making. So the industry gets it, and I think for the industry to be able to speak with one voice alongside government is, for me, very exciting and really a new feature of the world we're in today. So the second thing I want to talk about is ambition. It's not good enough to sit there while we watch the planet decompose and decay. It's not good enough to be focusing just on profit without thinking about the wider implications. Just let me focus on two specific things here. I would say that the company I work for and the industry sector I'm in is taking active responsibility for the transition from a carbon economy to a net zero economy. It's got to be active because the world must change. It must be in hand with the government because there's a lot to do and we need government's help. And alongside that, LNG is very much in the world of innovation to help this happen, where we're matching the aspirations and desires of investors with the outcome of what happens when we invest. And we're in the process of seeking to innovate, and we'll have more to say on this subject by mid-late summer on how can long-term capital really achieve residential retrofitting? How can long-term capital really achieve commercial real estate retrofitting? How can long-term capital up its game and invest and deploy more in renewables, and how renewables connect to the society we have at the moment? So there's a lot to say there, and we have to be ambitious. The third thing, as I said, wanted to talk about is complexity. So let's not pretend this is easy. And I think one of the consequences is we have to be able to act with versatility across a range of issues. Let me give you a couple of examples. If the world we're in was all about develop new buildings and new infrastructure so that it's sensitized to net zero carbon, that would be easy. But we're not there. Where we are is we have existing infrastructure, existing real estate, and we have to figure out how to retrofit so that we get to net zero. As I mentioned, that's a project LNG is actively thinking about at the moment. That is a harder challenge than putting up net zero buildings that are new. Much harder, much more intricate. The circular economy is much talked about, and there's another element of complexity. People don't really live and breathe the circular economy. They don't really have a wide perception of what it is that they're doing and how they can live within a circular economy. Let me give you an example of how things can change on a very small scale. We have a build-to-rent asset up in Walthamstow, which we launched a few months back, and there's bins. There's a recycling bin, as you might imagine. But rather than have the normal waste bin called other waste or general waste, we've called it landfill. And it's amazing how people stop before they put things in landfill, because that's where this is going to. And it's just a way of nudging people towards changing perception. Our ambition in terms of recycling, our ambition in terms of being sensitized to not overusing resources and not thinking about how you reuse is very great. But just the words we choose to use around this will start to make a difference to how people behave. So our ambition around not putting landfill out of our buildings in Walthamstow is very real, and it's amazing how small differences can change perception. On renewable energy, we talk about that very glibly, and it's very great. It's good to hear that the investment quantum is increasing in that area. And we do invest in hydro, we do invest in on and offshore wind and transmission, we do invest in solar. We're going to be investing in tidal, which for an island is an important part of the future. But technology is changing really quickly, so it's not easy. It's not easy to make the right decisions today that will be persistently right over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. It's tough. So we've got to be ambitious with our approach to the complexity there. And there's a whole range of other features going on around the built environment that are beginning to come to the fore. And actually at LNG, we're lucky enough to have a wider part of the company that can make private equity investments in businesses. So we've made investments in electric charging points for electric vehicles, for example. We've made investments in companies that source ground source heat pumps, which is part of the future when we move beyond gas-fired boilers. Those sorts of investments will form the jigsaw of how we live in the future, and there's a lot to do. As I say, it's complex. So just finally, and in conclusion, I just wanted to go back to those three words. We have got to be really thoughtful about our intent. We have got to be purposeful. We also need to be ambitious, because there are huge amounts of challenges that face us, and we've got to be really ambitious with that alongside government. And because of the complexity of what we face, our view there is that we have got to be versatile. And that's really all I had to say. Just final words, though. Really, the time is now. Thank you.
So I work for Grosvenor, Britain and Ireland, or GBI. A little about Grosvenor. The principal asset in Grosvenor is the London estate, which we have owned for over 340 years. And we manage commercial property, we do development, mixed use and so on. We also have our major project in Bermondsey, which is about delivering really a new community in that great part of London. And I also have a strategic land business which looks at delivering communities at scale at 2,000, 5,000 homes outside London, and we act in the master developer role in that sense. Grosvenor's purpose, and by Grosvenor I mean the property operating companies across the world, but also the wider Grosvenor estate, has a purpose which is to deliver lasting commercial and social benefit. And we are not allowed by our owner to deliver commercial benefit without social benefit in at least equal measure. And by social, we define that as environmental and community, and we're very seized on that. So Grosvenor is here for the long term, and that obviously fits very well with being on a planet with people still on it, which is what we all hope to be doing for some time. The sustainability journey in GBI has been interesting. Over the last decade, I think we've made great progress in a number of areas. So we've paid attention to diverting waste from landfill, getting our recycling rate up, retrofitting period properties, which has been a great exercise. We've learned an awful lot doing that. We're turning our attention to air quality. We've got green lampposts, and if those work, we'll roll those out more widely. And we've got a supplier charter, to name a few things. But I suppose the point is, and I've been with Grosvenor for 7 years and been helping to draw the strands together, is that we recognise it's just not enough. And so what we as a company need to be part of is revolution, not evolution. And to that end, we set ourselves some pretty ambitious 2030 and 2050 goals, which the board initially was a little uncomfortable signing up to because they wanted to know how we're going to get there. And we don't know how we're going to get there, and that's what makes them ambitious. But get there we must. Net zero operational carbon on our managed portfolio, eradicating waste on our estate, and getting a biodiversity net gain on every project we do. And to do that, as a company, we've had to focus really on leadership, and the whole leadership team, not just being interested or on board, but actually becoming zealots to make this happen. And if you do that, you get the rest of the business behind you, and that's actually what we're about now. So everyone in GBI knows that sustainability is not something we do. It's, you know, it's part of our day job. It is our day job. So what's the developer's perspective? Or rather, what are the issues I think we face? I've chosen 4. One is cost, the higher cost involved with taking sustainability measures. And of course, that is something which you tackle if you get in as early as possible in the thinking. And of course, if you get that wrong, there's a penalty to adopting policies unilaterally while the rest of the competition keeps trading in an uninitiated way. Viability is always a challenge on development projects, of course, and I'm not complaining about this. It's a statement of fact, but affordable housing creates a lot of that viability challenge if you layer on that additional cost with sustainability measures. then developments may not happen. And we're seeing real challenge in the strategic land world where councils want all the measures under the sun, and that makes the scheme, puts the scheme potentially in jeopardy. So we have to get to a place where where sustainability becomes a value enhancer, and it may require us to look differently at the way we value development and properties generally. The third challenge, I suppose, is the customer, and of course we all know the customer is king. Now, in Belgravia, we retrofitted 119 Ebu Street to Passive House standard. Very complicated. We learned a lot doing it, and we're very proud of this incredibly efficient building that we've created. But it creates not one penny of additional income, if you like. There's no premium for having at this stage, for having a home that's really cheap to run. Now that's going to change, of course, but that's where we are now. And in the strategic land business, our customer is actually the house builder. And if we are developing and selling service plots to house builders who don't want to be constrained by our design code, by our ambition for sustainability, they can just go and buy plots from other developers and choose not to work with Grosvenor. So I'm really interested to hear what Andrew's got to say from the house builder's perspective in a few minutes. And the final issue I'd pick up is just the volumetric modular construction, which we're very keen to make use of. And of course, what we're finding is that it's relatively in its infancy, and that affects our rather narrow supply chain. So we're looking for real support and encouragement for that to grow, to help us deliver better product. I suppose our wish list in terms of legislation, regulation, and guidance would be, firstly, I suppose, about levelling the playing field. We've got real ambitions. It's part of our DNA to do this properly, and we need sort of ambitious and demanding measures to level that playing field so we're all part of the same story. We ought to look at the whole the whole impact of buildings, the construction, the embodied carbon, but also building performance, not the specification of that performance, but its actual performance when it's up. And some attention to that is important. We want planners to give as much attention, or even more attention, to environmental concerns as they currently give to heritage concerns, and that will help. So I suppose we in Grosvenor would really like to see sort of well-consulted on mandated targets which help with that, levelling the playing field, and help bring us together so that we can start sharing the best practice that we're learning and really pushing our ambitions and our experience. I hope I haven't rattled through that too quickly. I suppose what I'll leave you with is that we're here for the long term. We're very keen to be, and are part of the UKGBC, and keen to work with people to make this better. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'll just move this slide on. I wanted to talk to you about a handful of principles that we're discussing in our business at the moment. And the first one is based around our purpose. So Telford Homes, some 3 years ago, was a small, medium-sized enterprise of 200 people. So very small. Our supply chain was 90% of it was also an SME supply chain as well. So for us, we wanted to develop bold ambitions, but we're in a small way, but actually develop up and demonstrate to others that we are making a difference. So we developed a new purpose. Now we developed the purpose because we wanted everyone in our business to be invested in what we're doing. So each and every one of us has a role to play. Take forward 3 years later, in October of 2019, we were acquired by Trammell Crow Company. That's an American developer owned by CBRE. So all of a sudden we were part of a 100,000 person business, and really positively they supported our brand, our values and how we operate. And we continue to have this discussion in the business of going beyond legal compliance, how we can develop our license to operate, which primarily for us as a London developer is within the London plan, but there will come a time shortly where we look beyond London. We're also incredibly interested in how we develop added value, because our marketplace is changing from an open market, affordable homes, and to a degree mixed-use development, to an affordable homes provider, mixed use, and build to rent. So immediately, our build to rent partners, who are typically institutional investors, are looking to move from purely a CapEx model to an OpEx model. But of course, as we've heard from the earlier speakers, we've got to do that in a proportionate and balanced way. But nonetheless, that's started to create a very, very different discussion within our business. But again, it must be around purpose. There's a lot of complexity in our landscape at the moment, our operating landscape, and there's a lot of convergence, which is actually very, very positive. But there comes a lot of risk in terms of operating environment. But we do think there's opportunity as well. So I'll show you a few more slides on how we think we're taking on board the opportunity to actually deliver better value, better outcomes, and that's for our customers as well as institutional investors and the neighbourhoods that we develop in. A core part of what we do is through our advocacy, so it's with UKGBC and other like-minded organisations, with our peer group as well. So we meet and when we talk regularly on how we're going to improve our business from an ESG perspective. So we really are starting to better understand the environmental, social and the governance aspects that we're dealing with. And that is fundamentally being driven by institutional investors in a much, much stronger way than we've seen previously. Hence, our reference to whole life cost, embodied carbon, and all the way through to an improved well-being for our customer. How do we protect the licence to operate? It's working together. So one of the calls we'd make to everyone in this room today is that we can't do it by ourselves. We've got to activate, we've got to work far more closely, we've got to collaborate, and some of those competitive edges, we've got to move away from that position, and we're going to work much more closely together. And the reason for that is we're talking about 2030 here, net zero carbon from a UKGBC perspective. 2 years ago, we set out our roadmap, and it's incredibly challenging. And the way we were going to meet it was through offsetting, but we can no longer do that. So as a business, we're about to make a commitment to science-based targets. We're going to use Carbon Disclosure Programme as a tool for doing that. We're also going to report against TCFD as well. So for us, there's a lot of voluntary commitments that we're not mandated to do from an operating perspective, but we think that's the right thing to do to improve our licence to operate. We also think that will help us deliver our difference, and that's incredibly important from our staff, from our supply chain perspective, and as I mentioned earlier, our future clients and our increasing clients. So for example, build-to-rent operators are going beyond BREEAM very good. They're looking for BREEAM excellent. They're looking for the WELL standard. They're looking for a whole bunch of other aspects and requirements. We've been asked to deliver home quality mark to level 5. So a lot of this is well in advance of where current policy is. So national policy is 2050, London policy is 2040, but some of the local authorities that we're talking to and future clients are now looking at 2030 and a much closer time frame. So for us, we've got to actually demonstrate that value through the whole of the land procurement process all the way through our build costs. And we believe that will make us more competitive in the marketplace, but we do understand that others will be more competitive on price alone. But we don't think price alone is the future perspective. We've got to be authentic in what we do. It's okay me stood here and telling you stuff. We've got to practice what we preach. And we believe as a business, that was an SME just a few years ago, that we're doing some pretty good stuff. But there are room for improvement, and that's incredibly important, how we go about that improvement in a pragmatic and a logical and a commercially viable way. How are we going to do that? We'll do it for our Building 11 Legacy strategy, which is 4 pillars. The first one is about creating a great place, and not just about place keeping, but it's also, not just about place making, but it's also about place keeping. The second is around our resource use and how we minimise our resource use. By way of example, circular economy is an area of work that we're focused on at the moment. The third area is around creative building solutions. Often we're developing alongside transport infrastructure and over-transport infrastructure. So we're going to deal with that in a really sensitive way. In the last 3 years, we've delivered churches, with mosques, we've delivered over 1,500 school, college and nursery places as all part of our offer. So we're dealing with some very complex mixed-use developments, and we've got to do that in a very, very sensitive and a very engaging and a very collaborative manner. I just wanted to reflect now on the materiality review we undertook in 2016. Now, I appreciate that all the narrative from the left-hand side of the screen may not be very easy to read. The slides will be available to you. The point I wanted to make is, in 2019, the slide has changed. The objectives and targets have changed. We've now got a top quartile, which is absolutely stacked, full of material issues that we've got to deal with. So around placemaking, around net biodiversity, around net zero carbon, through whole life costs, through improved well-being, responsible resourcing, and so on and so forth. Those are our targets and objectives that Telford is committed to over this next period of time through to 2030. And we can't do it by ourselves. So we're very much reaching out to our value chain and how our value chain can help support us in terms of journeying and going forward. To put that into perspective for you, there are 4 pillars. We set out objectives and targets, and the light-coloured narrative at the bottom of each page are areas that we're now picking up upon compared to 2016 that we hadn't done as much work on. So net biodiversity, social return investment, incredibly important how we work with local communities. TCFD, I've mentioned that. I've also mentioned the SBTs and whole life cost. The purpose around whole life cost is very much brought in focus by the asset owners who are buying into our schemes in futures, whether it's a pension fund, whether it's an institutional investor, or whether it's the capital markets. There's a very different perspective about an asset and actually creating a good asset and avoiding obsolescence in the future. So we're looking well beyond our license to operate perspective. It's challenging, it's incredibly hard work. As we've heard from previous speakers, we don't know all the answers at the moment, but we're on that journey to develop those responses. And the 4th point around smart business, we've got to strengthen our supply chain. Our supply chain needs to become more sophisticated, more detailed, and we need to do that in a more holistic way than we've previously done. And finally, we've got to tell people about it. We're going to tell people what we're doing at a corporate level, but also at a local level as well. The last couple of slides I'm going to leave you with. The first slide is our urban design toolkit. So it's 10 principles that we work on. So we're currently doing some mapping work against the New London Plan, the Building Beautiful Commission, and also government's view on design coding to make sure it's fit for purpose. Then the second wheel on the right-hand side is around social value. So it's how we listen to our communities, how we develop social value, and how we do post-occupancy evaluation into the long term. There's about 250 indicators that we could possibly measure to determine that social value, but we judge it on a project-by-project basis to ensure we get the right level of social value on each project. And the slide there is just a few highlights. I'm not going to talk about them. We're currently in reporting season, so we can't disclose numbers at this point in time, but our next report will be published in May of this year. But an area we're particularly pleased about from an indices perspective is that we're ranked second by Next Generation as the second most sustainable developer in the UK at the moment. But we can't rest on our laurels because we know that the competition is very, very strong, and we've got to continue the work that we're currently doing. The last few slides I'm not going to talk about. There's a couple of examples of our projects. The slide deck's available to you. It's quite diverse. There's different types of project offers. Then on the bottom of the screen to the right-hand side, there's some stats on about how we're doing our business. The whole of this report is verified. We think we're doing okay, but again, we need to do a lot more. And the challenge that we're setting out to everyone is we need to work together. From a government perspective, 2050 is too late. 2040 is being overtaken by the climate emergencies through local authorities, and we think positively institutional investors are coming with us on this journey. So we think from that complexity, we think that we're getting convergence. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I'm Julie Godefroy from CIBSI, but I want to say that some of the views are my own today, so don't blame CIBSI. And I was asked to talk about how we change regulations. I wish I knew, so I'm just going to talk about what we are doing to try to get there, and we don't know yet whether it will work. Sorry for that pointer. What we want, I think everyone in this room, is buildings that are on the way to net zero carbon, which are healthy and comfortable, but also importantly, that have data to show that they actually perform that way. And I do think that as much as the commercial sector might be different, when we're talking about housing or retrofit, it means we need regulations to get there. And why we, the professionals, need to engage is that other interests will always engage. This is my analysis of a recent inquiry on air quality and who responded. A third of them were from commercial interests, very largely from transport. So if we want to defend the common good, the environmental protection, we also need to respond, because the other side always will. And I wish I could show you the same analysis about who responded on Partel and Future Homes, but I can't. On the air quality inquiry, it was led by parliamentary committees, so all the responses are public. Everyone can see who responded what. From the Future Home Standard, all we know is that MHCLG are analyzing the responses. They are actually not made public, and I think that could be quite an easy change to make that would allow everyone to be a bit more informed and engaged. The way CBC engage with regulatory change is obviously through government consultation, working groups with civil servants, etc. There are downsides. One is that the level of interest from a minister can vary hugely. Churn is also very high. Civil servants move regularly, let alone housing ministers. And very often the outlook is short-term, electoral cycles, basically. So we also work a lot with the advisory bodies, such as Committee on Climate Change, Public Health England, who tend to be much more science-driven, data-driven, and have a longer-term outlook. There's two ways, in theory, to convince government. One is data, the other one is to change public opinion. There's no doubt that CBC is more comfortable working on data, science, facts. We think that will lead to more robust policy. We will avoid unintended consequences, etc. It doesn't mean it's fast. Public opinion could make things happen much faster, and maybe in a more democratic way. It would be really interesting to see what comes out of the Citizens' Assembly on climate change. But this is not typically how CBC engage with the topic. What we do try to do, though, is to change the narrative, because we know that government ministers, when we talk about regulations, are always very worried about being the nanny state that bans something or forces someone to do X and Y. And this is really such a limited way to look at things. We spend $2 billion a year on winter fuel payments so that people can stay in homes which are expensive to run and uncomfortable. So what we're asking for with regulatory change is also homes that are comfortable, healthy, cities that are green, walkable, where people actually want to live in. We're not forcing them to do something. And I think the recent engagement with the Partel and Future Homes consultation was a great example of how different voices overall had quite a good consensus, but expressed it in very, very different way. So on the right end of the scale, you have the institutions, slow, and on the left-hand side, the activists. And the RBA, CBC, the Green Building Council, we engage with the consultation as we always do. But there was an incredible amount of movement from ACAN, from Greenpeace, from Extinction Rebellion, LETI, protests in front of MHCLG on Partel. I mean, this is quite unprecedented on such a technical policy issue. And I'm really hoping that it means this will converge somewhere. Forget that. And a recent good example, I think, of us working together is the joint position statements from the Building Performance Network, where the RBA, CBC, the Green Building Council, and others essentially summarized our asks of government on building regulations. Essentially, is to say actual in-use performance should be subject to regulations. We should stop basically ending regulations at the as-built stage. We should start with energy and carbon, but we could move on to air quality and comfort in the future. Talking about public sector leadership, there's a lot they could do by procuring on the basis of actual performance. And we also need a system supported by government for data monitoring, reporting, and disclosure. Why data is important is because as much as designers, it's very useful for us to have detailed case studies. If we're talking about regulating in-use performance, we also need the volume of data to check policy trends, but also potentially to ask for regulations on an aggregate basis. So we don't want to spy on people's homes. Privacy does need to be protected. And two identical homes could have very, very different energy consumption. However, I think a piece of work for us is to determine what sample size does data actually start to reflect average building performance, irrelevant of the actual behavior of occupants. So this is why also we need volume of data. And I think we could still capture a lot of the stock. As you know, most of new building is from large house builders. 11, as it happened, built half of new UK homes last year. And the average size of new developments is quite large. So these large house builders, it's about, from what I can see, between 150 and 250 homes. So say if we reported per aggregate, per 50 homes, we would still capture a lot of the stock and make quite a big difference. The last thing that certainly we need to get better at is talk about money. And CBC are very uncomfortable with this. Typically, we don't. We've talked about viability. Now, the rules are incredibly opaque. The assessments are never published, or if they are, it's 90% blacked out. And the very term viability is really misleading. We need to find another word. Unviable could still mean very profitable. The other problem is that in the way we engage with policy consultations, we tend to focus on technical proposals, and we ignore the 200-page impact assessment that is published at the same time. Now, to give you an idea, in the recent Future Home Standards consultation, the impact was estimated by government to be just under £5,000 additional new build cost per home. But going back to these 11 largest house builders last year, they made on average £50,000 profit per home. So that impact is the little green bar on top that you probably can't even see because it's so small. And it doesn't even take account of other factors. Actually, £5,000 was the highest estimate by government. They themselves know there would be cheaper ways to get to the same standards if they applied fabric first. It's possible that some of the homes would have added value, or that some of the costs would be passed on to homeowners. But what's most likely to happen is that house builders would pay less for the land in the first place when they actually acquire new plots. And we know that's a massive proportion of housing costs overall. So we're not necessarily asking for a huge burden. Thank you. My call for action, if you can do one thing, is look at the Building Performance Network and sign in support.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I hope you'll agree. But thank you very much for sticking to time. You made my job much easier, panelists, but also really broad range and wealth of information there. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, I think, hopefully. And I'm going to do questions from the floor in just a moment. I just want to pick up on one recurring theme that came out in pretty much every presentation, which was around value and money. And just the question really being, if we, on balance, where the panelists think that the mandatory drive is going to come from market forces or regulation, if we don't have the sort of the viability and the value of some of these features coming through right now in terms of the way in which we're pricing them in. So where will we get some of that? And I pose that to everyone, not one person in particular.
I mean, it's a really difficult question. I mean, I was at REBA last year, and someone stood up and said, you know, value is a have got to reevaluate the whole approach to property, and those properties that are not efficient to run should be coming down in value, which is going to change the viability assessment of doing something about that. In answer to your question, is it quicker to do it by market forces or regulation? I'd hesitate to guess. Bill, you've got a view.
Yeah, I mean, Julie, it is a very good question. I think the reality of it is, in the long term, the market forces will decide, because I think behaviours of those that occupy and exist in society will place the right value on the right things. The problem we have at the moment is how you unlock that with some uncertainty ahead of us, and I think that's probably by and large where government come in to create a catalyst for moving in the right direction. And as often is the case, as it is around renewable subsidy, for example, if the government gets the call right and knows it has to fund something, it will get rewarded for that activity. So the industry needs to be confident, and we are very long-term anyway, but I think the government can help in the short term.
Julie?
Well, my only worry when we talk about that is that we need to differentiate commercial and residential sector. Because if we talk about less efficient homes having less value, who will end up living there? It's people who don't have the choice. So they would end up potentially in the least comfortable, most expensive to run homes that is not going to help their bills and that is not going to help health inequalities, which is really a very important reason why we're advocating for regulations at the very least in the housing sector. It's not a sector where people have the choice.
Okay, thank you. I think the answer is very clearly a mix of the two. Let me open up to the floor. We have roving mics. I'm going to suggest we take a few questions at a time. So we'll take those three. There's 3 hands there, 1 to your left. And if you could say who you are, your name and organisation, that would help.
Hi there, I'm Matt Marnie from PCPT. I just have a question really for Andrew from Telford Homes. Telford Homes obviously got all the necessary sort of industry accreditations. They work to BS 6001. They're part of the UK Green Building Company. UKGBC. I just have a concern about them. A recent development in Wallace Road, which is sort of in Hackney Wick, like where I live, unfortunately exposed children to large amounts of arsenic, lead, and naphthalene poisoning. And I just have a bit of concern about sort of how far these accreditations go in terms of trust. There was no embodied CO2 factored into the building. It was 10% affordable, which is obviously very low. So I just want to know, like, why. If they're exposing children on the school run to these chemicals, and
Okay.
it is, you can look at this on the BBC side.
Okay, thank you. I think we've understood the question. I
just want to know, like, why I could trust them on zero carbon.
Thank you. I'll take 2 more. 1 over here in the middle, and 1 at the front.
Hi there, Joe Giddings from Architects Climate Action Network. I was actually leading on our response to the Part L and Part F consultation recently. I wanted to ask a question about embodied carbon, because one of the things we were asking for was for embodied carbon to be included in the building regulations as part of the Future Home Standard. We just think that if declarations and reductions of embodied carbon are mandated by regulation, that this will ripple down the supply chain and have far-reaching effects on industries like concrete, cement, steel, and aluminium. So I guess my question is, how close are we to embodied carbon or whole life carbon regulation? Why is it not yet included in the Future Home Standard? And what you think the best way of regulating embodied carbon might be?
Great. Thank you very much. Question on embodied. And then just here at the front in the middle in the red shirt.
Jeff Beacon from the Pollution Tax Association. Can I just answer the previous question quickly? It's because there's no money in it. Embodied carbon you get away with. Carbon that you do year to year, people pay for.
Okay.
But I noticed coming in, there was a zero car development in Brighton on the boards outside. And the Joseph Randrew Foundation did some work commissioned some work on Derwentthorpe in York, which showed that people had carbon footprints of about 15 tonnes a year. These are mostly motorists. And 15 tonnes a year is just a few years of the remaining carbon budget. Now, the National Planning Policy Framework says we can't screw the world up, or there's another way of putting that, I'm sure.
Can I ask you to speed up the question?
Yes. So the question is, if we're going to have enormous carbon footprints by building for motorists, is that illegal because it's against the National Planning Policy Framework?
Right. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to suggest a slight broadening of that first question. Why should we trust a developer if something goes wrong on a particular site? But you, Andrew,
sure.
of course, have
sure.
first dibs on that question.
Of course, I'll catch up with Matt after this session. We'll have a discussion about the most detailed points that you raised. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So from a commitments perspective, we're out there where we're setting out what we want to do. We believe that we're a good business. We're setting out very, very broad ambitions beyond policy, beyond regulations. The work that we're doing is being well vetted by institutional investors and pension homes and houses and the likes of. In addition to that, we're fully disclosed within our business, which is also verified in terms of our reporting. But again, we can raise our standards across the piece by using science-based targets, by example. That's going to be heavily audited, and we think that's the right thing to do. Science-based targets will then evolve into embodied carbon, whole life cost, and there's a much, much broader scope of work that we want to do to actually demonstrate that we're doing the right thing and we're doing it well.
Thank you. Next question was on embodied carbon. So why is this not being factored into building regs? I should probably start with you, Ben.
Yes, although strictly not a base lead. So it is worth looking at. If you look at the UK's performance overall on embodied carbon, that chart I showed showing that sort of the rate at which we decarbonise the economy would look a lot less impressive. So embodied carbon is coming down a lot slower. It is coming down, but our track record isn't nearly as good. There are good and bad reasons for that. The good reasons are around the need to have a global effort, which is a lot of what we're doing through COP26, through the Paris Agreement, and through that sense that the embodied carbon to some extent sort of pushes effort around the system, and you have to have these national targets for territorial emissions in order to reach global agreement. That doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about embodied carbon, we should. Is there scope to focus on that in building regulations? Possibly, and I definitely think it's worth exploring. I wouldn't want to sort of preempt what my colleagues in MHCLG might say on that, but I think we recognise the problem and that our track record there is not nearly so strong as it is on territorial carbon.
Julie, did you want to?
Yeah, I think we're definitely one step further because we just don't even know what a target should be, to be honest. So your idea of first asking for assessments is the right one. I think there's also a lot of existing policies which are not called embodied carbon, but could actually do a lot, particularly around construction waste, and that could be addressed. We still waste a massive amount of materials, for example, but we are a little bit further in knowledge.
Any other takers?
I mean, I just think my point about being ambitious and demanding in target setting is the thing here, and if you consult on things well, but when you set the question, it's really ambitious and demanding of us as an industry, as a government. You know, we know then the direction of travel, even if what ends up being the legislation or the regulation being something more manageable than that. I think it's really important to be demanding in this.
The last point I would just add on embodied is the World Green Building Council has called for 40% less embodied on new builds by 2030. And a number of local authorities, including London, is starting to look at embodied carbon, and our IBA has set the target even higher than that. So I think we're getting quite a lot more noise around the topic than necessarily is reflected in regs. The last question was around NPPF allowing certain developments to take place where they have an unintended consequence of a large footprint. Yeah, sure. Any takers on this one?
I mean, let me have a go at that. I thought the decision on the third runway at Heathrow was probably the benefit of what we know now and in the future, a really important moment to even consider that sort of project with climate change in mind. I think for me is visibly to a lot of people who hadn't probably been thinking about it, a game changer. I think with regard to carbon footprint and car use, I suspect the future must look like electric vehicles using the existing infrastructure and electric vehicles that are produced in a zero carbon. Well, you're shaking your head. Alongside society changing, looking at the totality of what it does, including embodied energy, is clearly the answer. In the short term, I think getting people out of carbon fuel cars is an important thing.
Okay, great. I'm going to move us on. So, a couple more questions. There's two here. I think we've got time. I'll just take three. If you could keep them fairly brief, please, because we've got 7 minutes.
Can you hear me
left.
okay?
Yes.
That's Richard Coles, small building contractor from down there in Surrey. I don't know whether you guys like or loathe Bob Dudley, but in his leaving speech, BP Bob Dudley I'm talking about, he was saying that by 2040 there will be another 2 billion people on the planet, which is equivalent to another America and China together. That will require a third more energy production globally, which will probably be fossil fuel based, on the basis that renewables only account globally for about 4%, and technology and those advancements are just not going to be advanced quickly enough. I just wonder what the panel might think about that.
Okay, macro question there. There's a lady here with a question.
Yeah, this is a question for Ben. My name's Hilary Bowman from Tewkesbury Town Council. I'm not quite sure. I thought in 2016 there was going to be a very high building standards for net zero building, but on your slide you said 2025 future homes, and I wondered what would be different on the future home standard compared with the one that didn't happen in 2016.
Okay, great, thank you. And then the final question here, just at the front here.
Hello, my name's Alex from the London Reader. Yeah, it doesn't strike me that we're sort of taking the gravity of the situation into account and doing enough. You mentioned the Climate Assembly, and I think that will be really interesting. So called for by the 6 House of Commons Select Committees. So they're releasing their demands in April, and I'm wondering, I guess, Ben, what your department's plans are for responding to that, and maybe Bill as well, because that will sort of show, public consensus around what the public wants to do to reach net zero.
Okay, thank you very much. So first question was really around sort of demographics, population and energy. Any takers on that macro one?
Having a
Ben,
go.
for
So I'm a little bit more optimistic, I think, on the sort of energy demand than that suggested. So you talked about the sort of, certainly population will grow, certainly demand for energy will grow. I'm optimistic in two ways. One is, I think we're making massive strides on energy efficiency alongside that, and actually a lot of what we can do is offset that growth in population and that demand by building more efficient homes, by building more efficient power systems, by just reducing the total demand increase. And then the other reason is the fossil fuel-based bit of it. So I started off with a slide talking about growth in energy demand, investment opportunities, and a projection that 80% or so of that is likely to be low carbon. The reason for that is that the cost of low carbon energy is falling dramatically. So you look at offshore wind, for instance. 5 years ago, we were talking about having an industry challenge to get costs below £100 a megawatt hour, and people were looking at us as though we'd grown another head. You're now seeing south of £50 a megawatt hour and falling. So I feel a bit more optimistic about that one. I think we have to acknowledge that growing global population is a challenge, but I think it's one we're capable of rising to meet.
Thank you. Any further comments on that?
I'd agree.
I probably agree, actually.
Yeah.
I think smart cities, smart suburbs, and the way we're operating is changing. There's a lot to do in the next decade, but I think I'm more optimistic. I do think there is a challenge there around existing homes and existing buildings and how we can upgrade. So hence, I think there are definitely challenges in that space.
Great. Second question was around specifically the difference between 2016 zero carbon homes and the future home standard of 2025. I guess, Ben, that comes to you a little bit, but maybe Julie might want to comment as well.
Yeah, I'm sure you would want to. So I will duck the politics of it slightly and the sort of whys and wherefores of 2016 Family Council. But what's the difference? I think one fundamental one is there was this concept in the 2016 zero carbon home standard of the sort of off-site element of it, the last bit that could be met by essentially offsetting some of the emissions and doing things, and that was sort of presented politically as a tax on development. The 2025 Future Home Stand is much more focused on what are you doing on the actual development, making sure that it's using the best technology to hit that combination of energy efficiency and low carbon heat. I think the commitment of making sure that you get the low carbon heat is the other key difference I draw out, because that is fundamental to them genuinely being zero carbon on site.
Any other thoughts? No? So final question was really around the level of ambition, which was mentioned a few times actually in the different presentations, particularly Bill and George. Do you have a response to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the question was in terms of level of ambition, though, and to answer some of the other related questions. I think looking at my company and using it as a metaphor for what we're doing, if you get everyone on board, if everyone starts to take this seriously, you're going to get more people looking at the technical solutions, you're going to get more people demanding regulation, you're going to get more people saying, I'm not voting for you, I'm not working for you, I'm not working with you, unless you're taking this seriously. And I think we're moving much faster in that direction, and that's why if cause to be optimistic about us as a nation taking it more seriously across the piece and working together for those solutions. I'm not naive about that, but I do sense that we are starting at last to get all behind this, and that's what it's going to take. Otherwise, I don't think there's going to be a population growth of 2 to 4 billion. It might be something different.
Thank you. Bill, anything?
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the issues here is about to what extent are people willing to make change, and specifically personal sacrifices.
Yeah.
So people are being used to flying around the world, or petrol cars, or single-use plastic. To what extent I'll throw it out to the audience. Who's got an iota of guilt about anything that they do at the moment? And the chances are someone has got something that they do that they're trying to get away from those bad habits and move to a better world. But the awareness of that this year compared to prior years is wholesale different. That's great. And now it's about taking the actions. And by the way, to my colleague in the front row there, some people will have different opinions about what the right actions are. And in the medium to long term, it's really tough then to make the right decisions. But I think we have to, I'm going to make a beeline for you afterwards, sir, because I want to know what you think about your own question, because you obviously knew the answer. But the reality of this is we've got to be transparent, work together. That's individuals in the population, industry with government, society with politicians, the whole lot. And we've got to do it quickly, but it's difficult. Who in the audience has flown overseas in the last year? Most of you. I mean, I'm not going to embarrass anyone. Most of you will have done. And there's some habits there that we've all got used to. That's the truth of it.
Well, I think we're pressed for time, so I'm going to ask you one final closing question before we close the panel. I saw this on Twitter this morning, and I thought it was quite well framed, but I've slightly reframed it. So imagine Dominic Cummings calls you with Boris Johnson listening in. He asks you to suggest just one bang-for-buck policy that will decarbonise or to make sure that the built environment achieves net zero. What would you recommend? And keep it very brief, please.
Right. That's probably slightly less hypothetical a question for me than it is for some of the other panelists. So I'm not going to answer the question because I probably can't, but what I would say is, in terms of what has made a massive difference, so net zero has been a game changer, more than I expected it would be. It's been a game changer in government because what it does is it takes away the places to hide. The debate over the last 10 years or so has been, so we've got to decarbonise the economy. So where do we start? Which sector's easiest? Where should we focus? And where might we think this is just a bit too difficult? That debate stopped. You cannot look at any sector of the economy and say it's too difficult, but you can't get to net zero by doing that. So it has taken away the place to hide, and it has forced the pace, and that's been fantastic.
Thank you very much. Bill?
I think I'm not going to tell you what the exact answer is, but it's policy around aligning industry, government and occupiers to retrofit residential towards net zero but bearing in mind the idea that that can't just be about those that can pay and those that really can't afford to do that. So there's a rebalancing in society part of that as well.
Great, thank you. George?
Where you've set a date to get rid of diesel and petrol cars, and you're serious about that, it's going to drive the market to do something. We should come up with some equally demanding, very clear targets. For example, the use of gas for cooking and heating.
Thank you. Andrew?
Okay, I would suggest accelerated planning consents for schemes that go beyond compliance.
Great. Julie?
Regulations on the in-use stage of buildings, which means changing the Building Act, but compared to the changes that Dominic Cummings want to make on the civil service, the House of Lords, and just about everything, it's probably quite minor to change the Building Act.
Thank you, panellists. Thank you very much. Hopefully some useful ammo there for Ben to take back to base, but also for us all to use our influence towards. So just in closing comments, at UK Green Building Council, we spend every waking hour on this stuff. So if you're interested in it, please come and have a look or talk to us. Have a look at our website. We've published net zero carbon frameworks for buildings. And as a last sort of call to action for you all, please do be more demanding of the buildings that you occupy. All of us occupy buildings, whether that's through our homes or organisations that we work for. We can ask for those to be net zero carbon, and by driving market demand, I think we will drive towards mandating change. So thank you very much to our panellists. Thank you for taking part, and enjoy the rest of EcoBuild, Future Build.